Excuse me,
Oh,
Laurie.
Mr. Brackett, I'm sorry, Mr. Brackett.
Oh, I didn't mean to startle you.
That's all right.
You know, it's Halloween. I guess everyone's entitled to one good scare, huh?
What's up, everyone? I'm your host, Will, and you're listening to a bonus episode of One Good Scare, the show where we explore our favorite horror movies. So lately, I've had vampires on the brain, and I'm almost ready to release my full-length episode on Sinners. But in anticipation of that episode, it got me thinking about my favorite vampire movies of all time. It was surprisingly more difficult to narrow down. So what I'm going to do is give you a few honorable mentions, then my top 5. Before that, though, don't forget you can follow One Good Scare on Instagram at OneScarePod and on TikTok at One Good Scare Pod. Make sure to follow, leave a comment or two. Remember, I love interacting and discussing. Also, be sure to leave a 5-star review on Spotify and Apple Pods. It lets me know you're enjoying the show, and that goes a long way to keeping it going. And remember, my goal with One Good Scare is not to replace your viewing experience. It's to enhance it. So if you haven't seen any of these movies, or if it's simply been a while, my strong encouragement is that you watch them first, and then come back and give the show a listen. Of course, if you'd rather listen than watch, I appreciate that as well. Just remember, one good scare is one gigantic spoiler. Alright, let's dive right into my favorite vampire movies of all time. Honorable mention: John Carpenter's Vampires from 1998. This one is absolutely one of the most fun movies on my list. It's a wild ride that makes almost no sense and covers nearly every vampire trope in its runtime. James Woods plays a rebellious vampire hunter and slayer who works for the church, I think, because he also disrespects the church and its officials. He's chaotic and he's off his rocker, and by the looks of it nowadays, he may just be playing himself. Daniel Baldwin is his apprehensive sidekick, who looks like he can't be trusted, but also shows up in the most opportune of times. Truly, this is not one of John Carpenter's best movies, but it is one of his most entertaining. It's an unserious vampire movie that isn't comedic, and at times takes itself way too seriously. It's also gory as hell, and the scene in the Sunray Motel is one of the highlights of the movie. If you're looking for a vampire movie that'll keep your attention without making you think, John Carpenter's Vampires is the one. Honorable mention: Let the Right One In from 2008. Listen, there are only a handful of horror movies that I consider beautiful, and Let the Right One In is one of them. It's one of the most unique vampire movies I've ever seen. It's a sort of coming-of-age story of two teenagers, Oscar and Eli. And it's a vampire movie that's really about the difficulties of growing up, isolation, friendship, and death. And at a deeper level, it explores the dark side of humanity, bullying and violence. And at a few points, the movie deals with what might be pedophilia, and it gets incredibly uncomfortable. This is definitely one of the deeper horror movies out there, and maybe one of the best examples of elevated horror. Because the vampire element, it just really seems to be a metaphor for the hunger that drives behavior. Also, and let me not forget this, the pool scene at the very end is just an unbelievable piece of filmmaking. It's brutal, gory, shocking, and an absolutely beautiful shot. Alright, here are my top 5 vampire movies of all time. An important note though, Sinners is not included in this list because it's obviously the next episode of One Good Scare. But just note, it would absolutely be in my top 5, and right now, stands at number 3 overall. I'll skip it and add a number 3 for this episode. Number 5 is 30 Days of Night from 2007. I'll admit, I always forget to mention 30 Days of Night whenever I talk about my favorite vampire movies. It kind of flies under the radar. even though it's one of the most interesting and entertaining vampire movies out there. The film is set in Barrow, Alaska, at the start of the polar night, a time in the winter when the sun doesn't rise above the horizon, leaving everyone in perpetual darkness. A mysterious ship comes in carrying a literal boatload of bloodthirsty and merciless vampires, led by the terrific Danny Huston. 30 Days of Night came out in the mid-2000s, when there was a bit of a rush to adapt graphic novels to the big screen. You had 300, Sin City, Watchmen. There were a handful of these films that had a comic book feel to them, and were excessively gory. 30 Days of Night fits this perfectly. It's super gory. I mean, there are buckets and buckets and buckets of blood. There's limbs being torn apart, heads being chopped off with axes, explosions, industrial grinders. You get the idea. And the vampires in this one are fast, they're cunning, they're sneaky, and they give no fucks and have no mercy. There's one scene in Act 2 where they mock a victim before absolutely tearing into her. It's gratuitous for sure, but it also lets you know these vampires are fighters and killers, not lovers. The performances in this one are pretty top-notch. I mentioned Danny Huston. He's terrific as the head vampire. There's Ben Foster. Let's talk about him for a second. This might be strange to hear, but I think all he does is overact in every movie he's been in. Don't believe me? Watch Hostage, Pandorum, 3:10 to Yuma. There are actors who play certain roles to perfection. Ben Foster plays them to excess. And I love it. And it especially works in 30 Days of Night. He plays this gross, saliva-y, I really need a shower and a hug kind of drifter who is a forerunner for the vampires, while also being a crony. He just wants to be one of them so fucking bad. And I think his overacting style really works well for this role. And in a weird way, he's kind of captivating, in an I can smell you through the screen kind of way. Melissa George is terrific in anything she does. This is no exception. She's the heart and soul of the movie, and what she brings to the film keeps it from being a forgettable one-note gore fest. And of course, there's Josh Hartnett, in what I think is his best role. To me, he always plays these wooden type of characters, brooding, pensive, tense, and with little to no emotional range. And he's not really doing anything different in 30 Days of Night, but it's almost like he's been forced to move outside of his comfort zone. And he's really great in Act 3. And frankly, the closing scene of the movie is just heart-wrenching. Overall, 30 Days of Night isn't groundbreaking, but it is super entertaining. If you don't want to think too deeply while watching a vampire movie, and if you can stomach excessive blood, gore, and violence, then you can't go wrong with this one. Number 4 is Fright Night from 1985. Part of me feels like Fright Night should probably be higher on my list, but the other part of me remembers this being the first vampire movie I saw when I was a kid. I'm doing my best to avoid nostalgia, though I'll admit I'm a bit of a hypocrite, especially when it comes to the first movie on the list. I really think this is one of the best vampire movies out there. It's sort of a dark comedy that knows when to be serious. And don't let the dark comedy part scare you. It's not a kids movie or a young adult thriller at all. The movie centers on Charlie Brewster, a high schooler who is wary of his new neighbor after seeing him carry a coffin into a cellar. One night, Charlie plays Peeping Tom as his neighbor seduces a woman, and quickly becomes a detective when the next day, the woman's face shows up on the news as a murder victim. Charlie's convinced his neighbor is not only a murderer, but a vampire. So what does he do? He calls the police, who laugh him off. Then he reaches out to Peter Vincent, vampire killer, played masterfully by Roddy McDowall, who thinks Charlie has lost his fucking mind. Except Charlie hasn't, because his neighbor is in fact a bloodthirsty creature of the night, who is absolutely hell-bent on sinking his teeth into Charlie's mother, girlfriend, and best friend, before disposing of Charlie like a piece of trash. William Ragsdale plays Charlie Brewster, a kind of pain-in-the-ass teenager who doesn't know how to mind his own business, and frankly, he's terrific in the role. Amanda Burse, of Married with Children fame, plays Amy Peterson, Charlie's girlfriend. She's the heart and soul of the movie, an innocent young woman who just happens to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Stephen Jeffries plays Ed Thompson, affectionately known as Evil, and he's my favorite character in the entire movie. He's hilarious, vulnerable, even a bit pitiful, and he gets done absolutely dirty by Charlie's neighbor. I'll talk a bit more about this in a second, so stick with me. Chris Sarandon plays Jerry Dandridge, Charlie's neighbor and the charming, seductive vampire. He's threatening in this calming kind of way. It's almost like he hypnotizes you into thinking everything's okay, when in reality, he's about to bite your neck and fuck you up. And of course, there's Roddy McDowall, who plays Peter Vincent. To me, he's a scene stealer and perfectly blends humor with incredulity and then shock and finally courage. He's a real treat to watch on screen. I've always been a sucker for practical effects, and I will absolutely take the lowest low-budget movie with the worst practical effects over the biggest budget blockbuster with the best CGI. The practical effects in Fright Night are pretty terrific, and Evil's transformation scene is just gnarly and fantastic. Like 30 Days of Night, if you're looking for a fun way to spend 90 minutes, you can't go wrong with Fright Night. It's a dark comedy horror classic, and number 4 on my list, for a reason. Number 3 is Nosferatu from 2024. One of my favorite recent vampire movies, Nosferatu is stunning and gorgeous. The cinematography, dialogue, acting performances, all of it was wonderful. So why is it number 3 and not number 1? Partly because my top 2 is damn near impenetrable, and because I always like to make more recent movies earn it. As of now, I've only seen Nosferatu twice, and though I've enjoyed it both times, I need a few more rewatches to give my full assessment and review. That said, Nosferatu is a genuinely creepy movie that relies heavily on atmosphere, lighting, and score to build a deep sense of anxiety and dread. There are far fewer overt jump scares or horror elements than you'd probably expect, but the possession scenes are unsettling and hard to shake. When I think of gothic horror, Nosferatu comes to mind almost immediately, and director Robert Eggers is really a master of his craft. Now, you may not know this, but Nosferatu was an actual ripoff of Bram Stoker's Dracula. And when I say ripoff, I mean the stories are near identical. In fact, a few years after Nosferatu released, Florence Stoker, Bram Stoker's widow, sued and won for copyright infringement. The result was that all copies of the film were to be destroyed. Of course, a few copies survived, and 103 years later, we all know it as one of the most important and influential horror movies ever made. And that 1922 silent film was the inspiration and source material for Robert Eggers' modern masterpiece. I will say though, there are parts of the story that are difficult to accept. Count Orlok's grooming and subsequent sexual assault of Ellen Hutter, her self-sacrifice to destroy Orlok once and for all. Guys, the movie is beautiful, but damn, it's also a tough watch that raises legitimate concerns. Number 2 is The Lost Boys from 1987. Listen, if there was ever a vampire movie that could move to the top spot, The Lost Boys is it. Where we so often see vampires as romantic or terrifying and monstrous, The Lost Boys added another descriptor: cool as fuck. The cast is a literal who's who. Corey Haim, Corey Feldman, Diane Weist, Edward Herrmann, Kiefer Sutherland, Jason Patric, Alex Winter, Jamie Gertz. It's just jam-packed with talent. And what makes this movie work so well is that it knows when to be comedic and when to be serious. And the comedic moments are more smirk funny than haha funny. That's important, because The Lost Boys walks this line beautifully. The movie centers on Sam and Michael, Two brothers who move in with their recently divorced mother to their grandfather's house in Santa Carla, California. A beach town, Santa Carla seems like the ideal place for two young men to start fresh. Plenty of sun, sand, and beautiful women all around. Except, Santa Carla has a dark not-so-secret. It's teeming with bloodthirsty vampires. Enter Kiefer Sutherland and Alex Winter, two of the coolest vampires you'll ever meet. They're also bloodthirsty and violent monsters. If you've never seen it, I won't spoil it for you, and I'm planning to cover it in October. But rest assured, the movie is absolutely one of the best vampire flicks out there. And it may also have one of the creepiest and most haunting theme songs ever, Cry Little Sister. If you love movies that bring up a deep nostalgia for the 80s, The Lost Boys is exactly that. The movie is a time capsule of that era. From the music, including a random saxophone solo at the beginning, hairstyles and aesthetics, yet it holds up surprisingly well, thanks in no small part to its stellar cast. And number 1 is Salem's Lot from 1979. Guys, coming in at the top spot is Tobe Hooper's classic Salem's Lot. And I say Tobe Hooper because the movie, or rather the short miniseries, deviates significantly from Stephen King's story and novel. Nearly 4 hours long, Salem's Lot follows Ben Mears and Mark Petrie as they return to the small town of Salem's Lot, Maine. Mears, played by the late David Soul, wants to write a book on the old Marston House, an imposing and ominous hilltop mansion that's also allegedly haunted. He tries to rent it, but discovered it's already been purchased by Richard Straker and Kurt Barlow, two men who plan to turn it into an antique shop. Soon after, though, townsfolk either disappear or die under strange circumstances. And what we discover is far more horrifying than we could ever imagine. Alright, so my love for Salem's Lot is rooted in both nostalgia and a deep appreciation for storytelling. Listen, I warned you, I was gonna be a hypocrite on this one. It was one of the first horror movies I saw as a kid, and there are a handful of scenes that really just scared the shit out of me when I was younger. The little vampire boy floating in the window, the vampire sitting in the rocking chair, when the vampire bursts out of the kitchen table. The movie has some of the most enduring jump scares in horror history, and it's well regarded for good reasons. But I also really love good storytelling, and despite its over 3-hour runtime, the movie moves briskly, carrying you through the plot and building suspense along the way. For me, a good horror movie takes its time with world building and character development. We know bad things are going to happen to different people in that same place, but taking the time to develop these elements makes us care about the characters so that we feel conflicted when all of that bad shit finally happens. If you've never seen Salem's Lot, I can't recommend it enough. Just be sure to stay away from The Abomination that came out on HBO Max in 2024. The remake is devoid of everything that made the original an enduring classic. And remember, you can't go wrong with Salem's Lot from 1979. Alright, that's my top 5 with 2 honorable mention vampire movies of all time, not including Sinners. As always, thanks for spending your time with me on One Good Scare. I absolutely don't take it for granted. And of course, be sure to join me next episode as we dive into Ryan Coogler's modern masterpiece, Sinners. Till next time, I'm your host, Will. Thanks for hanging out.